What would you do if on a freezing Chicago night you found a 5-year-old girl alone at a bus stop, whispering that you were the angel her mother promised would come, only to discover that saving her would shatter your life in ways you never saw coming? Before we dive into the full story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories of resilience, unexpected miracles, and lives that find hope when it seems all but gone. Every click counts and every story matters. Now let's begin. Snow fell in heavy silent sheets over Chicago, blurring the city's edges into something that felt more like a memory than a place. The streets near Lake Michigan glistened beneath the amber glow of street lamps, and the wind howled with the kind of bite that didn't just sting skin, it gnawed straight through bone. Most people hurried inside that night, retreating to fireplaces and soft lights, locking the winter out like a predator at their door. But Nathan Cole was not most people. He stood at the base of a skyscraper on Wacker Drive, a black coat draped across his shoulders, his polished shoes crunching over salted pavement. The meeting he had just left should have left him triumphant. By morning, the acquisition of a European tech conglomerate would make him one of the most powerful men on the continent. His investors would toast him. His name would flash across financial headlines. It was everything he had built himself to want, everything he had been trained to pursue. And yet, for reasons he couldn't explain, Nathan didn't climb into the waiting black car idling at the curb. He waved his driver off and began to walk. The cold was punishing, but he welcomed it. Each gust of wind scraped against his face, cutting through the thick layers of his tailored coat, but it felt honest. More honest than the champagne-slick congratulations waiting for him at his penthouse. His breath curled white in the air as he traced a path along the frozen edge of the lake, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his mind both numb and restless. He had everything yet. He felt like a man carrying nothing but shadows. It was on a quiet block near Millennium Park, where the city's festive lights had already begun to dim, that Nathan saw her. A small figure curled tightly on a rusted bus stop bench. The flicker of an overhead street lamp stuttered above her, casting her in alternating strips of light and shadow. At first, Nathan thought it was just a pile of discarded clothes. But as he stepped closer, he realized it was a child, a little girl no older than 5. She wore a thin frayed sweater that sagged off her small frame, her knees drawn up to her chest, as though she could make herself disappear into the tattered fabric. A stuffed rabbit, its left ear torn nearly off, rested in her lap. Her sneakers were soaked through the laces, knotted and broken, and each shallow breath she took clouded the icy air like smoke. Nathan stopped. The city seemed to stop with him. There was no traffic here, no sound, but the restless wind and the faint hiss of snow sweeping across the sidewalk. He crouched down a few feet away, his chest tightening against a feeling he hadn't known in years, an ache that wasn't ambition, wasn't anger, wasn't calculable. Her eyes opened. Wide, startlingly clear, and far too calm for a child in her state. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look surprised. She simply blinked up at him, her lips a muted blue from the cold. "Are you the angel Mommy said would come?" she whispered. Nathan's throat constricted. He wasn't sure he'd heard her right over the wind, but the way she looked at him, steady, unafraid, as though she had been expecting him, rooted him to the spot. I'm not an angel," he said, his voice low, unsure why he felt the need to answer so carefully. "It's freezing out here. Where's your mom?" She glanced down at the stuffed rabbit in her lap, stroking its frayed ear. "She went to find dinner, said she'd be back before the snow covers my shoes." Her gaze shifted to her sneakers where flakes had already begun to collect along the worn rubber edges. "But you're here now. That's what matters." The simplicity of her words hit him harder than the wind ever could. Nathan swallowed, glancing down the empty street. There was no one in sight. No signs of a parent, no cars, just the hollow whistle of winter threading through the alleyways. He looked back at the girl and saw her hands shaking violently despite how tightly she gripped the stuffed rabbit. Before he could stop himself, Nathan shrugged off his heavy wool coat and draped it over her small frame. The coat engulfed her, hanging to the ground like a blanket, but the moment it settled around her shoulders, she exhaled a soft, almost contented breath. For a moment, the two of them sat there, their breath mingling in the cold as the city's lights glimmered faintly behind them. A sudden, metallic creak broke the stillness. Above them, the old bus stop sign, loosened by the wind, tilted dangerously on its rusted post. Before Nathan could think, the wind gusted hard, and the sign came crashing down, landing with a sharp clang, less than a foot from the bench. The girl gasped, startled as a shard of metal scraped across the pavement. Nathan instinctively threw an arm around her, shielding her from the falling debris. The silence that followed was heavier than before. The girl tilted her head, looking up at him. "See?" she murmured softly, as though nothing had just happened. "You are the angel." Nathan stared at her, at the way she clutched the coat around herself, at the quiet trust in her eyes. And for the first time in years, something in him cracked. Not in fear, not in ambition, but in a way that made him feel alive. He didn't know why, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't leaving this bench until her mother came back. What he didn't know was that by the time dawn broke over Chicago, this little girl, this stranger in the snow, would change everything he thought he knew about what it meant to live, to love, and to finally come home. Sarah Bennett had learned long ago that trust was a luxury one she could no longer afford. Trust, in her experience, had a way of crumbling at the exact moment you needed it most, like when her husband walked out with a suitcase and a muttered excuse about finding himself leaving her and their daughter behind in a one-bedroom apartment with rent they couldn't pay. Or when the restaurant at Navy Pier, where she had poured years of sweat and care into every plated dish, closed without warning, its doors chained shut overnight because of a bankruptcy filing no one had seen coming. The world had taught her a lesson. Harsh and unyielding, you survive by relying on yourself and no one else. That night, trudging through the icy gusts that cut down East Randolph Street, Sarah clutched a thin paper bag to her chest, her fingers numb beneath her gloves. Inside were 2 styrofoam containers of soup and half a loaf of bread, the only food she had managed to secure from the shelter's kitchen after waiting in line for over an hour. The wind carried the smell of Lake Michigan, sharp and metallic, and she moved faster, her boots slipping on patches of black ice, her heart pounding with urgency. Emily was waiting. She had been gone longer than she promised. Every minute away gnawed at her the cold, a constant reminder of what could happen if she didn't return quickly enough. When Sarah finally turned onto the block where the bus stop sat, the sight made her stop cold. A man was there, crouched near the bench where Emily usually waited, his black coat now wrapped around her tiny frame. Emily sat up straighter than usual, her small hands buried in the coat sleeves, her wide eyes fixed on the stranger, as though listening to something he was saying. For a second, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The bag slipped from her hands, the containers tumbling into the snow, steam curling into the bitter air as the soup seeped into the ground. "Emily!" she shouted, her voice sharp with panic breaking through the wind. She rushed forward, scooping her daughter into her arms with a desperation that felt almost feral. Her body formed an immediate shield, her eyes snapping up to the man. "Get away from her." The man, Nathan, stood quickly but didn't step closer. His hands rose, palms open in surrender, his expression calm but unreadable in the dim light. "I'm not here to hurt her," he said evenly. "She was alone. I stayed with her, that's all." Sarah's eyes narrowed. She scanned him clean-shaven, expensively dressed, even without the coat, his shoes too polished to belong to someone who understood nights like these. He was out of place, every inch of him screaming of a life she no longer believed in, a world that had doors and keys and warmth on demand. People like him didn't belong on streets like this unless they wanted something. And she had met enough of those people to know that kindness often came with a hook buried deep inside. You don't get to wrap yourself around someone's child just because she's cold, she said, her voice low-edged with steel. Nathan's eyes didn't waver. I didn't touch her, he said softly. I gave her my coat. I stayed because no one should be alone in weather like this. She told me you were coming back. I was going to wait. Emily stirred in Sarah's arms, her cheek pressed to her mother's shoulder. Mommy, he's nice, she murmured sleepily. He kept the wind away, like Coco does in the stories. Sarah glanced down at her daughter. Her skin, though pale, was warmer than before, no longer trembling from the cold. She looked back at Nathan, weighing the scene, the abandoned soup, the heavy coat swallowing her daughter. The man, standing with snow settling in his hair, making no move to reclaim what was clearly worth more than anything Sarah had touched in years. Who are you? She asked, her tone still guarded. Nathan, he said simply. Just Nathan. I was walking by, that's all. He gestured vaguely toward the lakefront, his hand still raised slightly as if to show he carried no threat. Sarah didn't trust him, not yet. But the way Emily curled into the coat, the way her breathing had steadied, left her with a decision she hated having to make. They could leave Trudge through another 2 miles of frozen streets to the overcrowded shelter where the air reeked of mildew and desperation, where they would sleep on a mat surrounded by strangers who sometimes took more than they were given. Or, Nathan spoke again, his voice low, almost careful. There's a motel 4 blocks from here, nothing fancy but warm. I can cover the night, anonymously. You don't owe me anything. Sarah let out a dry, bitter laugh, one she didn't feel. That's what they all say, nothing's ever free. He didn't argue, he didn't even flinch. He just met her gaze, something unspoken but steady in his eyes, and said, You're right to be cautious. I'd be the same. But tonight isn't about owing me. It's about keeping her safe. The wind whipped around them, lifting Emily's hair like wisps of smoke. Sarah stared at him, at the coat at the empty bus stop, and felt the sting of her pride and her fear battling inside her chest. Finally, with a slow, reluctant nod, she said, Just for tonight. Nathan didn't smile or offer any platitudes. He simply nodded, once stepped back and gestured for her to follow, as he led the way toward the distant neon glow of the motel sign. Sarah adjusted Emily in her arms, feeling the heat of the coat seep into her frozen skin. As they walked, Emily stirred again, whispering softly, He's warm, Mommy. Warmer than the wind. Sarah didn't answer. She just held her tighter, her eyes fixed on Nathan's tall figure ahead, her mind turning over questions she couldn't silence. Who exactly was this man, and why on a night like this did it feel like he was the only other soul awake in the entire city? Nathan Cole was not a man accustomed to lingering thoughts. His life was a sequence of transactions, deals, closed numbers, won empires built. But ever since that night at the bus stop, something kept tugging at him, subtle but insistent, pulling his focus away from spreadsheets and stock tickers toward a single image, a little girl swaddled in his coat, and the defiant guarded stare of her mother as snow gathered at their feet. Days passed, but the memory didn't loosen its grip. By the 4th morning, Nathan stopped pretending to ignore it. He called his assistant not to request a background check, though the impulse gnawed at him, but to ask for directions to a community church in Old Town, where, according to a brief conversation with the motel clerk, a young woman and her daughter sometimes volunteered in exchange for hot meals. He didn't tell his assistant why. He didn't even fully know himself. That evening, Nathan stood just beyond the wrought iron gates of St. Matthew's Church, its stone steps layered with fresh snow. Through the frosted windows he could see Sarah. She moved with a quiet purpose in the kitchen, her hair tied back a borrowed apron cinched around her waist. The sleeves of her sweater were rolled up, and her hands worked methodically as she diced vegetables, stirred massive pots of broth, and slid trays of rolls into the oven. There was nothing glamorous about it, but something about the scene. The steadiness in her movements, the way she nodded softly to the older volunteers around her, held Nathan's attention longer than any boardroom could. He stepped inside, eventually the warm air heavy with the scent of garlic and fresh bread. Sarah glanced up, her expression neutral, a flicker of recognition passing in her eyes before she turned back to her work. She didn't ask why he was there, and Nathan didn't offer an explanation. Instead, he quietly rolled up his sleeves and began stacking bowls, ladling soup, and carrying trays to the folding tables, where people most wearing threadbare coats and eyes dulled by exhaustion waited for their first hot meal of the day. It became a rhythm over the following weeks. Each night, when the corporate world went home to skyline condos and polished lobbies, Nathan found himself in the basement kitchen of St. Matthew's. He learned quickly that Sarah treated everyone the same, whether they were a volunteer, a regular, or someone too ashamed to meet her eyes when she placed food in their hands. She didn't pity anyone. She offered dignity, greeting each person by looking them in the eye, sometimes offering a quiet word, sometimes only a nod. Emily, too, had grown bolder. She took to sitting near the kitchen door, crayons scattered across the table, drawing scenes Nathan quickly came to recognize: houses with smoke curling from their chimneys, gardens full of flowers, tables heavy with food. More often than not, Nathan found himself seated beside her, listening to her explain each drawing as if it were a blueprint for the life she dreamed of. "Mommy says houses like these are for people who belong," she said once, her voice small but certain. "I think we'll belong somewhere one day. Maybe with you telling the stories." Nathan had no response for that, not immediately. He only reached for a peppermint from his pocket, a habit Emily had come to expect, and placed it in her palm. "Then we'll make sure the story has a happy ending," he murmured. One night, as the church kitchen emptied and the last of the diners drifted back into the winter streets, Sarah was gathering leftover containers when the distant sound of shouting cut through the calm. It came from the alley 2 blocks away, sharp and panicked. Nathan and Sarah exchanged a glance before moving toward the sound, Sarah clutching the strap of her tote, Nathan already pulling his phone from his coat. They found a boy no older than 14, cornered by 2 older teens in hooded jackets. The boy's face was bloodied, his hands trembling as he clutched a plastic bag that seemed to hold nothing more than a few clothes. Sarah didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her voice firm and clear, as she shouted for the aggressors to back off. When one of them sneered and took a step closer, Nathan closed the distance between them, his presence deliberate, his voice cutting through the tension. "Walk away, now." The hooded teens exchanged a glance, muttered something under their breath, and disappeared into the darkness. Sarah knelt immediately beside the boy, her fingers gentle as she checked the cut along his brow. "We'll get you to someone who can help," she murmured, tearing a strip from the scarf around her neck to stem the bleeding. Nathan was already dialing for an ambulance, his jaw tight as he watched the boy's shallow breaths. Later, as they waited for paramedics beneath the flickering streetlight, Sarah glanced at Nathan. There was no trace of his usual corporate composure, no mask of detachment. His coat sleeves were dusted with snow. His hands red from the cold, his expression etched with something raw and unguarded. "Why are you really here, Nathan?" she asked quietly, her voice almost lost to the wind. He didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on the boy, then on Sarah, then on the stretch of empty street beyond them. "Because I don't want to keep walking past people anymore," he said finally. "Not him, not you, not anyone." Sarah studied him for a long moment, the wind tugging at her hair. She didn't smile, didn't soften, but something in her gaze shifted a flicker of acknowledgement, faint but present. When the ambulance finally arrived, Nathan helped lift the boy onto the stretcher, his hand lingering on the cold metal rail for a moment longer than necessary. As the siren faded into the distance, he and Sarah stood there in the snow, Emily's drawings folded in his coat pocket, the city around them both vast and strangely quiet. And for the first time, Nathan felt as if he wasn't simply watching someone else's world. He was stepping into it one small act at a time. Nathan had never been one for gestures, at least not the kind that couldn't be quantified in a quarterly report. But the longer he spent at St. Matthew's, the more nights he found himself walking alongside Sarah through the cold streets of Old Town, the more it became clear that some things could not be measured. Not the way Emily's hand would slip into his as naturally as if it had always belonged there, nor the way Sarah's eyes softened when she thought no one was looking, and the steel she carried finally set itself down for a breath. He didn't want to offer them charity. He wanted to give them something that could not be taken away again. That's how the Hearth and Spoon began. On a quiet morning before his board calls and endless investor briefings, Nathan walked the length of Wabash Avenue until he found a boarded-up cafe, the kind of place that might have once been filled with the smell of fresh pastries and the sound of late-morning laughter. It was forgotten now, its windows clouded with dust, but he could already see it. Brick walls scrubbed clean tables filled with people who had nowhere else to feel welcome. A kitchen alive with the hum of Sarah's voice and the clatter of pans. It would be a restaurant, yes, but also a training ground, a sanctuary, a place where those who had been pushed to the margins could learn work and belong again. Nathan signed the purchase papers under the name of his company's philanthropic arm. His own name never touched the documents. He wanted Sarah to step into it without feeling the weight of obligation or the sting of pride. He imagined the look on her face when she saw it a chance, not a handout. But truth has a way of rising, no matter how carefully buried. It was a Thursday afternoon when Sarah overheard him. She had come to St. Matthew's early, hoping to prep for the evening meal before the others arrived, when Nathan's voice drifted from the hallway. He was on the phone, his tone low, but unmistakably businesslike. "Yes, finalize the transfer today," he was saying. "The Hearth and Spoon should be ready for renovations next week. Make sure the foundation's name is on every document. She doesn't know I'm involved, and I want it to stay that way." Sarah froze her hand, tightening around the handle of the knife she'd been using to chop carrots. The words settled over her like ice water, each one colder than the last. She stepped into the hallway before she even realized she was moving. Nathan ended the call just as their eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. Snowlight from the frosted window cut across Nathan's face, and for the first time Sarah saw him not as the man who had ladled soup beside her, or crouched beside Emily at a bus stop, but as the figure she had always suspected lurked beneath a man with money power and motives she couldn't quite trust. "You've been lying to me," she said, her voice low but trembling. Nathan took a step toward her. "I haven't lied, I just didn't tell you everything." Her laugh was short and sharp. "That's not better. All this time I thought maybe—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "I thought maybe we were building something real. But you were just adding us to your list of causes, weren't you? Another project for the benevolent CEO. That's not what this is," Nathan said, his voice rougher than usual. He reached for the back of a chair, gripping it as if steadying himself. "I didn't do any of this because I needed a project. I did it because what Sarah's eyes flashed, though, the sheen of tears blurred them. because we made you feel good about yourself, because we're a convenient way to balance out the cold headlines, you can hand me a restaurant. Nathan, but don't pretend you're handing me my dignity. The words hit harder than he expected. He opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing that nothing he could say in that moment would untangle the web of pride, fear, and betrayal threading between them. Sarah had already pulled off her apron and set it on the counter, her movements clipped and final. "Keep your café?" she said quietly, her voice cracking on the edges. "Keep whatever plan you had for us. Emily and I will figure it out. We always do." Nathan stepped forward, but she was already at the door, Emily's drawings spilling from her tote as she swung it over her shoulder. He bent to pick one up, a page filled with a crookedly drawn house smoke, curling from its chimney, 2 figures, and a small child standing beside it. At the bottom, in Emily's uneven scrawl, were the words, "I just want a warm home with Mommy. Maybe with you too." By the time Nathan straightened, the door had closed behind them. The kitchen felt cavernous, every sound amplified, the soft hum of the fridge, the drip of the faucet, the muffled city noise beyond the walls. He stared at the drawing for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. It wasn't the empty cafe on Wabash he feared losing. It wasn't even the idea of redemption or proving to himself that he could be something other than a man who bought solutions. What hollowed him out, left him standing motionless in that silent kitchen, was the realization that somewhere between the falling snow and Emily's peppermint sticky hands, he had found something he didn't know he needed. And now, because he had tried to give instead of simply stay, it was slipping through his fingers. The first snow of December had fallen heavy and unrelenting, coating Chicago in a white quiet that seemed to soften the edges of everything. For most, the city felt hushed, almost serene. For Nathan, it felt hollow. 3 days had passed since Sarah walked out of St. Matthew's, Emily clutching her hand, her tote spilling crayons and dreams in their wake. He had gone through the motions of his life like a ghost, bored, meetings, phone calls, staring at the skyline from his penthouse window. None of it filled the space they had left behind. The deals felt like noise. The city felt foreign. Each morning, he found himself wandering the route he had first walked with them, the stretch near Millennium Park, the alley by St. Matthew's, the neon buzz of the cheap motel 4 blocks from the bus stop. He didn't find them. He didn't call. For the first time in years, Nathan Cole, a man who prided himself on control, could do nothing but wait and wonder if he had ruined the only thing in his life that felt real. On the 4th night, with the wind biting through his coat, Nathan found himself back at St. Matthew's. He didn't ask anyone where Sarah was. He didn't step into the kitchen or speak to the volunteers who whispered when they saw him. He simply walked to the far corner of the room and sat on the old wooden stool by the counter where Sarah used to prep trays while Emily colored beside her. He folded his hands on the counter, stared at the faint scratches in the wood, and waited. The kitchen smelled of ginger and broth, warm and alive despite the ache in his chest. He didn't know how long he sat there before the door to the back swung open. Sarah stepped into the room, her hair loose around her face, a steaming bowl of soup in her hands. She said nothing as she set the bowl down in front of him. Not a greeting, not a question, just the quiet weight of the gesture. "It's cold out," she murmured finally. "I added extra ginger. Eat." Nathan looked at the bowl, then at her, his voice low but certain. "I don't know when it started," he said. "Maybe the night I saw you give your last bowl of soup to a man who couldn't even look at you. Or maybe it was the night Emily told me she drew a house with smoke because she thought that's what home was supposed to feel like. But somewhere along the way I stopped coming here to help. I came because I needed you. Both of you." Sarah's eyes flickered, but she didn't interrupt. "I don't know how to want things I can't control," Nathan continued. I don't know how to ask for something without feeling like I need to earn it, but I know this nothing else I have. Nothing else I build feels like it matters unless it leads back here. To you. To Emily." Sarah looked away for a moment, her breath catching almost imperceptibly, then back at him. Her voice when it came was softer than he had heard it before. "Then, don't leave again. I never needed someone to rescue me, Nathan. I needed someone who would stay even when it's hard, especially then." Nathan stood slow and deliberate until he was close enough that his hand rested lightly on the edge of the counter between them. "I'm not staying out of guilt," he said quietly, "and not because I think you need saving. I'm staying because you're what I didn't know I was missing." Sarah's hand moved over his, tentative but certain. Their fingers laced together, and the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was grounding like the snow settling softly outside. From the doorway, a familiar giggle broke the moment. Emily peeked in her mittened hands, gripping the frame, her eyes wide with delight. "I told you he'd come back, Mommy," she whispered, her smile spreading until it reached her eyes. That winter, Chicago felt different. 1 year later, the Hearth and Spoon opened its doors, not as a monument to charity, but as a living, breathing space where second chances were baked into the very walls. The once boarded cafe now bustled with life, a dining area where anyone could sit without judgment. A kitchen where Sarah trained men and women, rebuilding their lives, a small classroom in the back where Emily sometimes practiced her letters with volunteers between handfuls of peppermints. On opening day, the place overflowed. Former shelter residents, local families, donors, and volunteers filled every seat. Nathan stood on the small stage, not in a tailored suit, but in a simple wool coat and open collar, scanning the room, as if anchoring himself to every face. Just as he reached for the microphone, a blur of motion zipped past the curtain. Emily, now 6, climbed onto the stage beside him, clutching a toy microphone she refused to put down. "This is my dad," she announced to the crowd, her voice bright and unfiltered. "Everyone says he's a miracle, but he's not. He just stayed. And that's better." Laughter and soft applause rippled through the room. From the side, Sarah pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes shimmering in the soft light. Nathan crouched beside Emily, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You know what, kiddo, I think I wished for you too." That night, in the small cottage behind the Hearth and Spoon, the three of them sat together by the fireplace. Outside, paper lanterns floated into the winter sky, carrying scribbled wishes from the community. Emily knelt on the windowsill, her breath fogging the glass as she pointed upward. "That one's mine." I wished for more hugs. Nathan wrapped his arms around her, and Sarah pulling them close as the scent of cinnamon and warm bread filled the room. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice a whisper just for him. "We used to wish for a miracle." Nathan's gaze followed the lanterns as they drifted higher, his hold on them tightening just slightly. "Turns out," he murmured, his breath warm, in the quiet, "you were the miracle I never knew I could ask for." And beneath a sky lit by lanterns and soft snow, they didn't just find warmth, they found home. Not given, not bought, built together, one small act at a time. Nathan Cole was the man who seemed to have everything: wealth, influence, a skyline penthouse that looked down on the lights of Chicago like a kingdom. Yet for all the power and privilege he commanded, his life had been empty, dictated by spreadsheets, and silence measured not by moments of meaning but by margins and mergers. It wasn't until a bitterly cold night, with snow falling thick and relentless along the streets near Millennium Park, that his world collided with something that would change him forever. A little girl named Emily huddled on a rusted bus stop bench. Her sneakers soaked her lips blue from the wind, clutching a stuffed rabbit like it was her only shield against the cold. He hadn't planned to stop. He hadn't planned for her to call him an angel or for her quiet trust to shatter a lifetime of detachment. But he couldn't leave, not when her small voice told him her mother was out searching for dinner, not when snow began to blanket her shoes as she waited. That night, Nathan stayed sharing his coat and his presence until Sarah Bennett, the girl's fiercely protective, proud and weary mother, appeared out of the storm. Their meeting was tense, guarded, but in that moment a thread began to weave between three lives that were never meant to cross, a thread made not of charity or convenience, but of something deeper. Over the weeks that followed, Nathan found himself stepping out of the sterile world he'd built and into the warmth of something real. He joined Sarah at St. Matthew's serving meals to those who had nowhere else to go, walking with her through streets he'd never dared to tread, learning from her quiet resilience. Emily, ever the spark, began drawing pictures of chimneys and warm kitchens, little blueprints of the home she dreamed of. Through small acts, Peppermints shared bowls of soup passed with care, even standing beside Sarah to defend a frightened boy from danger. Nathan began to understand that connection wasn't built through grand gestures or transactions, but through staying when it would be easier to walk away. Yet, even as he tried to give Sarah and Emily a future, his instinct to fix things the only way he knew, by building, buying, orchestrating, nearly tore everything apart. When Sarah discovered that the cafe he had secretly purchased and planned to transform into the Hearth and Spoon was his doing, her pride and pain flared. To her, it wasn't a gift. It was another reminder that her life had become a cause her dignity threatened by the very person she had begun to trust. She left, and Nathan, stripped of the illusion of control, came to see the truth he had been avoiding. He didn't want to rescue Sarah and Emily. He needed them, not as an answer to his loneliness, not as redemption for his wealth, but as the family and meaning his life had been missing. In the end, it wasn't the cafe, the money, or the gestures that mended what had broken. It was the simple act of staying. Nathan returned to St. Matthew's not with explanations or offerings, but with quiet certainty. He told Sarah the one thing she needed to hear, that he would remain, not as a savior, not out of guilt, but because she and Emily were the home he hadn't known he was searching for. And from there, something extraordinary was built, not given. Together they opened the Hearth and Spoon, a space where warmth and second chances were baked into every loaf of bread, where Sarah could lead with the skill and grace she had fought to keep, and where Emily, with her giggles and peppermints, became the ambassador of a place that finally felt like home. The lesson in Nathan, Sarah, and Emily's story is one: many of us need to be reminded of true connection and love are not about rescuing someone or solving their struggles with easy fixes. They are about standing beside others, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's hard, and building something together instead of handing it down. In a world where loneliness runs deep despite our constant connection, their story reminds us that what most of us crave is not a miracle, but presence, someone willing to stay to see us, and to believe in the value we already carry. And maybe for each of us there's an opportunity to be that kind of presence. Maybe it's checking in on someone who feels invisible. Maybe it's choosing to listen instead of trying to fix. Or maybe, like Nathan, it's realizing that the life we've built isn't truly complete until it's shared with people who bring us back to who we're meant to be. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of the power of quiet acts of love and the kind of hope we can all help create, we'd love for you to join us. Subscribe to our channel so we can continue bringing you stories like this, stories of healing, of second chances, and of the unexpected ways we find our way home. Together, let's keep these moments alive, one story at a time.